To the online class for standard 10. So in the previous class we had read A Triumph of Surgery. Some portions are still left. So before reading the chapter, I would like to ask you some of the questions. So these are multiple choice questions. You can note down these things in your classwork copy. You can write down extra questions. So tell me, what will be the first answer? What was the name of Mrs. Pumphrey's dog? Ben, Tommy, Tricky, Johnny. Yes, the correct answer is Tricky. Who was Mrs. Pumphrey worried about? Herself, her maidservant, her dog, her son. So the correct answer would be C. That is her dog Tricky. Tricky falls ill because he met an accident of bad weather. He didn't get proper food to eat. His mistress overfed him. So which one is correct option? D number. That his mistress, can you tell the name? Yes, Mrs. Pumphrey. She overfed him. She gave him extra food which was not necessary. How did it will be Tricky. How did Tricky look because of that? Very thin, like a blotted sausage, very smart, always ready to run. So what will be the answer? Like a blotted sausage. He was too fat. He was hugely fat. And he was looking like a overfed person, overfed dog. And let's come to the question number 5. When Tricky was seriously ill, who did Mrs. Pumphrey make a frantic call? To her son, to her husband, to a vet doctor, Mr. Harriet, to her maidservant. So the correct option is C. That is the veterinary surgeon, Mr. James Harriet. Where did Mr. Harriet take Tricky? To his clinic, to Mrs. Pumphrey's house, to a public hospital for vets? Nowhere. So the answer will be to his clinic. That is the surgery. 7 number. When Mr. Harriet took Tricky to his clinic, Mrs. Pumphrey was happy, excited, wailing, thanking the doctor. So when Tricky was taken out of the house of Mrs. Pumphrey and towards the surgery, so what was the reaction of the lady? So she was wailing, she was crying. What did the doctor give Tricky at his clinic? Many injections, medicines, no food for 2 days, only milk and chocolate. Which one is the correct answer? It's C. That's no food for 2 days. Let's come to the 10 number. 9 number is missing here. I think I know a cure for you. Who is I? I refers to Mrs. Pumphrey, Mrs. Pumphrey's husband, Mr. Harriet, Mrs. Pumphrey's servant. Which one is the correct answer? It is Mr. Harriet, the narrator. I think I know a cure for you. What is the cure here? What will cure or treat or make him perfect? Controlling Tricky's diet. B number, giving him a surgery, giving injections, keeping under observation. So the correct answer will be the first one. That is controlling Tricky's diet. What did Mrs. Pumphrey think her dog is suffering from? Fever, malnutrition, stomach pain and footsore. So footsore. What will be the right answer? It will be malnutrition. What was Tricky's real disease? Stomach pain, vomiting due to overfeeding, cholera, fever. So it is vomiting due to overfeeding. Mrs. Pumphrey was a very dash lady. What kind of lady she was? Miser, poor, cruel, rich. The correct answer is rich. At his surgery, the doctor gave Tricky no food for dash days. We already know this answer. We have discussed it earlier in some of the question here. At 2, 3, 4 and 5. So answer will be 2. What was Tricky's main fault? Fatness, inactivity, laziness, greed. So it was greed. Greed for what? Money? No. It was greed for food. He never knew how to refuse food. So the answer will be greed. Greed for food. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. Here the meaning of the word hovered means to move here and there or hung around, anxiously, curiously. So in the background, that means at her home. So she was moving here and there. She was curious, she was anxious, worried for Tricky. And how many times she called the narrator? ringing a dozen times for a day for the latest bulletins. Bulletins is for news. So she used to call several times a day to know the well-being or hear about of Tricky. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. Dodged refers to avoided. So the narrator he avoided the questions like his cushions, the dog's cushions were turned regularly or not. He was wearing proper coat according to the weather or not. So he never answered these questions, rather he tried to avoid these. And what he was able to tell to her, that the little fellow, who does he refer here? The little fellow refers to the dog, Tricky, was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. Convulsing meaning gaining health. So he is recovering. So he is recovering very rapidly. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. So, as we know, Mrs. Pumphrey was a rich lady and she was over caring for Tricky. So, what she did? So, when she heard that Tricky is recovering fast and Tricky is gaining health, she thought she needs something to build up his energies, to build up his muscle, build up his strength. So, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending 2 dozens of eggs at time, and then what happened? For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. As you know, Tricky was not given any special food, rather he was on a very strict diet. 2 days only water he was given in the beginning, and then the same food which was given to other dogs was provided, and he has to rush and he has to eat that. And what Mrs. Tricky was doing? So she was sending eggs, and who was eating them? So it was the narrator and the partners. They were not giving the eggs to the dog, rather they were enjoying it. Let's see what happened next. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. So now what happened? When after sending the eggs, she started sending bottles of wine. And for whom? For Tricky, as it is thought that wine will recover, or it will help in recovering soon. So she started sending bottles of wine. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. So why she was sending it? It was given by her for enriching the blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So the wine and eggs made the food of, or the lunch of these people, ceremonial. So they started enjoying it. It was like a festivity, and they had a very good time. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. Constitution means here physical appearance, physical build-up. So finally what arrived? Brandy. For a few nights the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled and reverently drunk. So reverent means respect, with respect. So what they did? So Mrs. Pumphrey used to send eggs, wine and brandy for whom? Tricky. And they were eaten and drunk by the narrator and the partners or the people working there. So they had a very good time. So for some days they enjoyed this beautiful delicacies. They were days of deep content, satisfaction. Starting well with the extra egg in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously around the fire with the brandy. So it was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest. But I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. You can easily guess why it was a temptation for the narrator and the parties or the partners to keep Tiki as a permanent guest, because so they were enjoying these delicacies. You can see that from the above paragraph. They were days of content, deep content, means satisfaction, starting with extra egg and then improved and sustained by the wine, and then they finished it luxuriously with the brandy. So they had this temptation, they had this feeling to keep Tricky permanently. But the narrator knew that on the other hand, Mrs. Pumphrey, who was there worried, was really worried for Tricky, was suffering. And after a fortnight, after 15 days, what happened? He called. He was compelled. He was bound to make a phone call to Mrs. Pumphrey, and she was told that the little dog has now recovered completely, and she can come and collect him, and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" So what happened? So after the call, within minutes, a beautiful car and black metal car came outside the surgery, the clinic, and the chauffeur, here refers to the driver. So the driver opened the door, and Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, and she was really worried, tensed, and she was holding her hands tightly, and her lips were trembling. She was eagerly waiting for the good news, eagerly waiting for the that dog is fine. So she was really nervous. She was really worried, tensed, and she asked that, "Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is the dog really better?" What the answer was given? "Yes, he is fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I will go and fetch him." So the narrator James told to Mrs. Pumphrey that yes, he is absolutely fine. No need to worry for him. Rather, you sit in your car and I will go and bring him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. So now you can see when the story started, so how he was behaving. He was lazy. He was lying on the rug. He was not walking properly. He was breathing heavily. So he was seriously ill. But now there is a transformation, change in the behavior of Tricky. So what he is doing now? So among the dogs, his ears are flapping, and his tail is waving, and the little golden figure of Tricky, it was playing with the other dogs. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds. He chased, almost brushing the ground. Now you can see there is a, you can say that is the tremendous change you can find in Tricky's behavior. So now he is no longer dull and that rheumy. Rather, his eyes were sparkling, and he was having good muscles, hard-muscled animal. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, you can see the picture. So let's see what happened. He took off from my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh," and then had to defend herself as he swamped over her, licking her face and barking. So now you can see what happened. So when the narrator carried Tricky through the passage, along with the passage to the front of the house, and chauffeur, the driver, was still holding the car door open. So and this Tricky saw the mistress. He was so happy to see the mistress. He took off. He jumped from the arms and took a jump and came to the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey, and Mrs. Pumphrey was startled as she was holding the dog, and the dog swarmed over her, hugged her, licked her face, and started barking. So the dog was showing the love for mistress. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. So what happened? So when the dog and the mistress they were lost in their excitement. The chauffeur, the driver, was called by the narrator, and he was told to take all those things which were thrown into the car while they were coming to the surgery. So the toys, beds, and the cushions, coats, everything, bowl, special bowl. You must remember those bowls for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So none of them were used by the doctor. So what happened then? So everything was brought back, and Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window when they were moving. So she took her head out of the window, and tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." She found Tricky to be active, energetic, and excited. He is no longer lazy, unhealthy. Rather, he has become fit and fine because of surgery. So, she calls it triumph of surgery and feels thankful and grateful to James Harriet for this positive change. So, now let's come to the word meaning. So, these are the meanings of different words from the portion which we read today, and it's a work to write down the question answer which I have given in the beginning. This word meaning will help you to find out the actual meaning. It will help you understand the chapter. Thank you, and we will do the question answer in the next class.